Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the new reference recording. Now, I've done one of these before for Verdi's Requiem, and I think it makes sense to do it for Tchaikovsky's last three symphonies, because that discussion ignited a storm of protest, largely engendered, I think, by a misunderstanding as to what a reference recording is and what the criteria were for the selection thereof. Now, when we talked about Tchaikovsky's last three symphonies, the reference recordings, there were two of them, were Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra and Herbert von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic, for reasons which I discussed pretty extensively. Notwithstanding, many people insisted, jumping up and down and screaming and carrying on, a couple of them rather nastily, actually, that it had to be Mravinsky with the Leningrad Symphony on Deutsche Grammophon, which it certainly was not. And the reason it was not, as I explained at the time, was because if you were a normal person, not a hardcore classical music aficionado, having listened to 25,000 versions of everything, and you walked into your record store looking for those works, you would have been recommended, depending on whether you were in the US or Europe or something, either Ormandy or Herbert von Karajan. That's just the way the world worked in those days. And I was there, and I know how the world worked in those days. And that's the way it was. It's very difficult for some people to get through their heads, I've noticed, that the reference recording is not your favorite recording. The reference recording is a consensus choice based on what the circumstances on the ground were. And as I have mentioned many times in this series, and it's worth pointing out again, we live in a period now where no general consensus is possible, for the most part. There are always exceptions. This is one of them. But there are always exceptions. And generally speaking, there's so much stuff and so much of it's been available and it comes and goes at random and there's no consistent marketing or time spent trying to create careers and reputations in order to sell particular artists and their views of particular works, that it's almost crazy to talk about reference recordings now, the way things are now. And so when people were jumping up and down and saying, well, it had to be Mravinsky, that was really based on their view of the situation today, where Karajan and Ormandy do not have the luster that they had back in the 50s and 60s. But that was a period. It was a time when a consensus was possible and did exist. And there were enough recordings, it was a limited amount of recordings that most people kind of were able to get their brains around, and certain artists were known for certain repertoire. That was all possible back then, and that's what happened. And that's what I'm describing. And some people have said, well, it's a waste of time. It doesn't help us today. It doesn't do anything. Well, maybe it is. Maybe for some people it is. But it's history. I mean, it's like saying that history is worthless. There's no point in knowing what happened in the past. It's just useless. I mean, it's ridiculous. Of course it's interesting. Of course it's valuable to know what the situation was on the ground back in the days when there was a much stronger consensus building energy in the world of classical music recordings, when there were only a few big labels making classical recordings, which were marketed vociferously and kept in print for decades and were available to people in sufficient quantity and with sufficient promotional energy so that they began to sink into the public consciousness as the reference recordings. And that's what I'm trying to describe. I mean, is it going to be a perfect description? Of course not. I mean, it's based on my view of what was going on. But the difference is that from a very early period, I was paying attention. I was really curious about that. I mean, I'm a historian by training. That's what I did. It's what I have my master's degrees in, and it's what I taught. And I have a keen interest in the history of recordings, the history of works on record, and the public perception and reception of these recordings. And so, anyway, I stand by my pick for the reference recordings, but I would also say, and this is an interesting historical process, that today, if you had to pick a reference recording, if you could, and it wouldn't be easy, frankly, given all the stuff that's out there, Mravinsky would be quite a good choice. Definitely a fine choice. Why? Well, for the same reason that he was a reference recording. The Ormandy and Karajan were reference recordings. It's been in print continuously. It never got promoted the way Ormandy and Karajan did. Therefore, its uptake, its reception, the perception of the value of these recordings took much longer to be established, but it was issued on compact disc relatively early in Deutsche Grammophon's life, which was a good thing. And so there's been time. And Mravinsky's reputation also quietly has increased over time, whereas Karajan's and Ormandy's decreased after their death, immediately after their deaths, and has continued to sort of exist in a somewhat twilight thing, whereas Mravinsky is known for this and for very little else. I mean, there were a lot of live recordings of various things, and he has his cult following. And the Mravinsky cult, of course, was quite vociferous, insisting that these must be the reference recordings. But cults are cults for a reason. They're cults because nobody else is paying attention to them, and they're desperately insecure and determined that everybody, know that their guy is the guy. Well, okay, that's their problem, right? It's not ours. And it says nothing about what's happening in the larger world of classical music. Because one of the things that concerns me, and one of the things that I'm fascinated by, and one of the reasons I did this series, is because I'm very, very concerned and interested in the public perception of classical music and the way that it's marketed and sold. That's a whole different issue from, what your favorite recording is, or what the best recording is, or any of those things. It's a function of the industry, the business. And the business I find fascinating, endlessly fascinating, because it's endlessly incompetent and aggravating. And the stuff that's going on is completely insane. And so it's fun to go back and sort of think about some of these things that are reference recordings or were reference recordings, and what's happened to them in the meantime, and how things become reference recordings. So I would say that over the years, this performance, this box, has gained in stature as others have lost stature. But that's not a common occurrence. In order for that to happen, you have to have some remarkable circumstances. You have to have works that are continuously in the basic repertoire and continuously recorded, that people are usually talking about and that they know, discographies that people have been paying attention to. And the irony for me, of course, in this being a reference recording is that it's a reference recording, generally speaking, among people who are younger, people who today are looking for Tchaikovsky Symphonies 4 through 6 and are asking, well, which version should I get? And people will naturally jump up and say, whoa, get Mravinsky. Well, they weren't saying that in the 60s and early 70s. They were saying, amongst the fine performances, you will get Mravinsky. I mean, it was there. People loved it. People respected it. And as I said in my original talk, it was an extraordinary conception of the works. It wasn't the kind of performance that was, it was not the sort of recommendation that you made for people who were getting started. It was the kind of recommendation you made for people who knew the work and knew the music and were able to understand just how different and remarkable this was. But in order to appreciate it, it really helped if you had started out with Karajan or Ormandy or Bernstein or Mazel or Beta or one of those folks who were doing Tchaikovsky cycles and doing them in a less, shall we say, extreme way. Because that was the tradition, that was the standard. Well, nowadays, I mean, there is no tradition. There is no standard. People are playing this stuff on period instruments, God knows, usually horribly. So we have lost that sense of shared idiomatic understanding of particular performance styles. And the romantic performance style particularly is on the outs Oh my goodness. Young conductors really can't play Tchaikovsky in a particularly convincing way. Romantic music with surging gouts of passion and is just not today's style, not today's taste. It is among listeners, but not among performers so much. There's that rift. And so Mravinsky has been there all along, waiting for the recognition that his followers would say that he deserved. And I'm happy to give it to him because it's an extraordinary set. If somebody said to me today, well, what Tchaikovsky symphonies should I have, for my first Tchaikovsky symphonies 4, 5, and 6? Should it be, who should it be? I wouldn't say offhand Karajan or Ormandy because Ormandy is stuck in an enormous 400 disc box and Karajan is stuck in an enormous 400 disc box, and he did 75,000 versions of each symphony. So how do you pin down the actual performances? If you stream it, maybe you can find individual performances. But I would say, indeed, Mravinsky's the go-to guy. Mravinsky, the other one that I like very much is Muti, but Muti is also in a jumbo, ginormous box. What are you going to do? Because of the way these things are marketed, whether or not there's a consensus, it's almost impossible to tell people where to find it or how to get it in an easy way. That ease of acquisition, the naturalness of just going to your local record store and grabbing your Ormandy Tchaikovsky or snagging your Karajan Tchaikovsky, it's gone. It's totally gone. And because of that, because the marketing aspect has disappeared totally, from what these labels are doing, because they don't know what they have and they don't know how to sell it. They're not really interested. There's a natural process in which one of these old standbys bubbles to the surface because there is only this. If you say Mravinsky and Tchaikovsky, this is what you're getting. Yes, there are the earlier mono ones. Okay, yes. And then there are the live Mravinsky Tchaikovskys, 30 trillion live recordings of all that stuff. There's all kinds of garbage now surrounding Mravinsky, but that's for his cult followers. That's not for normal people. For normal people, this is the one. And there it is, the new reference in Tchaikovsky 4, 5, and 6. And I'm perfectly happy to say that. But I just think it's interesting and important that we understand what the circumstances are and why these things came to pass and what the history has been. That's the point of this series, not the idea of everyone just running around as they usually do, saying, my favorite's this is my reference, I like that one. Well, yes, that's true, but nobody cares in the context of this series because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who have actually paid attention to the discographic history of the works and what the likelihood was that a normal classical music lover looking to start a record collection would get a certain recommendation to buy a certain recording. That's what I'm trying to get at here, however imperfectly it happens. So there you go. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.